We're going to pass, but honestly, do yourself a favor and pass too. That was the last thing they said to her, not a form rejection. Not a polite no, a favor. Delivered with a smile that had not touched the eyes of the man wearing it, a man in a Patagonia vest over a crisp white shirt, the uniform of a certain kind of confidence that mistakes itself for intelligence. He said it the way men say things when they are certain the other person has no recourse. When they are certain the conversation is already over. She was sitting across a glass table on the 14th floor of a building in Menlo Park, California. The pitch deck she had spent 4 months building was open on the screen behind her. She had driven 3 hours to be in that room. She had worn the gray blazer she kept for moments that required her to be taken seriously. The one with the small gold pin on the left lapel, a pin her grandmother had given her, a tiny compass rose in worn gold, the kind of thing that costs nothing and means everything. The man in the Patagonia vest, his name was Garrett Finch, managing partner, Crestline Ventures, had not looked at the screen once after the first slide. He was already reaching for his phone. She did not look down. She did not look away. She looked at him with the kind of stillness that is its own kind of answer. She said, "Thank you for your time." She closed her laptop. She unpinned the compass rose and held it for a moment in her palm. Then she pinned it back. Nobody in that room knew who she really was. Nobody in that room knew what she was already building. And Garrett Finch, managing partner, 14th-floor office, name on the door, had just turned down the single best investment opportunity of his career. Have you ever been told that your dream wasn't worth betting on? Not by someone who had looked closely. By someone who had decided, in a glance, before you even finished speaking? Let me take you back, 34 years. Because what walked into Crestline Ventures on a Tuesday afternoon in October didn't begin in a pitch room. It began in a kitchen in Shreveport, Louisiana, where a woman with a gift for numbers and a gift for people was raising a daughter to understand that those two things together were a kind of power the world would spend a long time pretending she didn't have. Nadia Josephine Carroll grew up on Fairfield Avenue in Shreveport, Louisiana, in a house that was narrow and tall, and painted a yellow that had been bright once, and had faded to the color of old paper. The house had 4 rooms and a history. Her grandmother, Ruth, had bought it in 1961 for $11,000, a transaction that had required Ruth to bring her employer, a white attorney named Mr. Boudreau, to the closing as a character witness because the bank had not otherwise been willing to proceed. Ruth had signed the papers, shaken Mr. Boudreau's hand, and never asked for a favor from anyone again as long as she lived. Nadia's mother, Celeste, was a registered nurse at Willis-Knighton Medical Center. She worked nights, which meant she slept until 2 in the afternoon, which meant that Nadia, from the age of 8, made her own breakfast, walked herself to school, and spent a significant portion of her childhood in Ruth's kitchen. This was not a hardship. Ruth's kitchen was the best place on Fairfield Avenue. Ruth Carroll had never finished high school. She had left at 16 to care for her own mother, and had spent the subsequent 60 years making up for that departure through the most systematic program of self-education that Nadia had ever encountered in a person. There were books in every room of the house, not decorative books, reed books with broken spines and penciled margins, stacked on every flat surface as if Ruth had been interrupted mid-sentence and would be back shortly to finish. She cooked while she talked. This was a thing about Ruth. She was incapable of standing still in a kitchen and being quiet. She talked about whatever she was thinking about, which was usually something she had recently read, and Nadia sat at the kitchen table and listened, and sometimes talked back, and those conversations were, Nadia would say much later in her life, the most important education she received. "Money," Ruth said once, stirring a pot of red beans without looking at it, "is not a thing you accumulate, it is a language. Most people never learn to read it, and then they wonder why they can't speak to anyone who does." Nadia was 11. She was eating a biscuit. She thought about this for a long time. "How do you learn it?" she asked. Ruth said, "Same way you learn any language, you live inside it. You listen more than you speak until you understand the grammar." Ruth had spent her life living inside it in a specific way. She had owned her house outright for 20 years. having paid off the mortgage 14 years early through a series of small decisions made with absolute consistency. She tracked every dollar that moved through the household in a ledger book she kept in the kitchen drawer. The same drawer she kept her pens and her reading glasses and a small gold compass, rose pin that had belonged to her mother. She had bought it because she believed in orienting yourself. "You cannot go anywhere," she said, "if you don't know which way is north." When Nadia was 12, Ruth taught her to read a balance sheet, not the way it is taught in school, as an abstract document produced by corporations for regulatory purposes, but as a story. "The balance sheet tells you what a thing actually is," Ruth said, "as opposed to what it says it is. You learn to read this and you will never be deceived by a number again." Nadia sat at that kitchen table and read balance sheets for 3 years. Ruth supplied them from wherever she could find them. Annual reports she requested by mail from companies she found interesting. Old financial statements she picked up at the library, the books of her own household, translated into formal accounting format just to practice. By the time Nadia was 15, she could read a balance sheet the way other 15-year-olds read novels, and with the same appetite for what happened next. She went to Xavier University in New Orleans on a full academic scholarship. She studied business administration with a concentration in finance. She was precise and brilliant, and had from the beginning an unusual quality. She was as good with people as she was with numbers. She could read a room the way Ruth had taught her to read a balance sheet. Not what the room said it was, but what it actually was. Who was nervous? Who was performing? Who was the real decision maker? And who was there to make the real decision maker feel comfortable? This quality made her exceptional situations immunes, where most people, confronted with numbers, forgot about the humans attached to them. Nadia never forgot. The numbers were the language. The people were what the language was about. After Xavier, she went to work for a regional insurance company in Baton Rouge, then a larger insurance conglomerate in Houston. Then she moved to a fintech startup in Atlanta where she was the first finance hire, and where, over 4 years, she built the financial infrastructure from a spreadsheet and a prayer to a system that processed $47 million a month. The startup was acquired. She received a modest payout. She watched the founders receive a great deal more for the thing she had largely built. She noted this without bitterness. She was making a list. The list was, in fact, a business plan. She had been watching, for the better part of a decade, a specific gap in the financial services market. Community banks and credit unions serving predominantly Black and brown communities were systematically underserved by the technology platforms that had transformed banking for everyone else. They were too small for the enterprise solutions designed for the big institutions. They were too complex for the consumer fintech apps designed for individuals. They existed in a middle space that the market had decided was not worth addressing. Nadia had decided the market was wrong. She had spent 3 years building the business plan, not a pitch deck, a business plan, 112 pages. Market sizing, competitive analysis, regulatory pathway, technology architecture, go-to-market strategy, 5-year financial projections built on conservative assumptions, and stress-tested for 3 different recession scenarios. She had done primary research, interviews with 31 community bank CEOs, surveys of 400 credit union members, a regulatory landscape analysis she had commissioned from a boutique law firm in Washington, D.C. The business was called North True. The name came from the compass rose. The name came from Ruth. She needed $6 million to get to product launch. She had spent 8 months trying to raise it. She had taken 42 meetings with venture capital firms. The meetings followed a pattern, so consistent it had stopped surprising her somewhere around meeting 23. They would bring her in. They would be polite, in the particular way that people are polite when they have already made a decision. They would ask questions that were not about her business. Questions about market size that she had answered on slide 4. Questions about the regulatory environment that she had addressed in a 20-page appendix. And she would answer them patiently. And then, somewhere in the last 5 minutes, the energy in the room would change, and she would understand that the decision had been made before she walked in. Nobody said the actual thing. Nobody said the thing they were thinking, except the last one. Garrett Finch, managing partner, Crestline Ventures, 14th floor office, Menlo Park, California, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, at the end of a 40-minute meeting in which he had looked at his phone twice and refilled his coffee once, had said it out loud. "We're going to pass. But honestly, do yourself a favor and pass too." And then he had picked up his phone. She drove back from Menlo Park on the 101 as the sun went down over the bay. She drove for a while without music. The compass rose pin was on her lapel. She kept her hands at 10 and 2. She called Ruth from the car. Ruth was 87 years old and still in the house on Fairfield Avenue. She still kept the ledger in the kitchen drawer. She was watching a documentary about migratory birds, which she did not pause when she answered the phone, because at 87 Ruth Carroll had decided she was done pausing things. Nadia told her what had happened. Ruth listened. Then she said, "Baby, who told you that you needed them?" Nadia drove for a long time after that without saying anything, and somewhere on the 101, in the dark, with the lights of the Bay Area sliding past on either side, and the compass rose pin catching a bit of light from the dashboard, she started doing a different kind of math. She had $380,000, her own money, the startup payout, savings from 11 years of working carefully and spending less than she made, one investment that had gone unexpectedly well, $380,000, not $6 million. But Ruth's voice was in her head. Who told you that you needed them? She had one more meeting the next morning, a coffee meeting, not a pitch meeting, a mentor-type conversation with a woman named Sandra Okoro, who had founded and sold 2 fintech companies, and now sat on 3 boards and generally had more advice than people had time to receive. Nadia had scheduled it weeks ago, before the Crestline meeting, before the answer she already knew she was going to get. She showed up. She told Sandra what had happened at Crestline. Sandra listened to the whole thing. Then she asked 3 questions. They were sharp questions about the unit economics of North True's pricing model, and Nadia answered each one without hesitation, and Sandra nodded each time in a way that was not encouragement. It was recognition. The recognition of one person who does the work watching another person who does the work. Sandra said, "What would you do with 3 million instead of 6? Nadia said, "I'd build the core product and pilot it with 5 community banks. I'd delay the consumer layer by 18 months. Sandra said, "Show me that version of the model." Nadia had it. She had built 6 versions of the model. 2 weeks later, Sandra Okoro wrote a personal check for $750,000. She also made 3 phone calls, to a former board colleague, to a woman who ran a family office in Chicago that specialized in financial inclusion, investments, and to a retired banking regulator she had known for 20 years who had recently been looking for a place to put his own capital. The phone calls produced $2.1 million in commitments. 3 investors, no pitch deck required, no 14th floor offices in Menlo Park, no Patagonia vests, $2,850,000, not $6 million. But Nadia had rebuilt the model. She knew what to do with it. She incorporated North True in November. She hired 4 people, a lead engineer she had worked with at the Atlanta startup, a regulatory specialist she had cold-emailed after reading her paper on community banking compliance, a head of customer success who had spent 8 years inside credit unions and understood the operational reality from the inside, and a young woman just out of Howard University who had the same quality Nadia had recognized in herself at 22. She could read a balance sheet the way other people read stories. She kept the team flat and the overhead low and the scope narrow. She was not trying to boil the ocean. She was trying to solve one specific problem for one specific set of institutions with perfect precision. She worked 18-hour days for the first 4 months, not because the culture required it. She had explicitly told her team she did not believe in performance theater, that results were what she cared about, and that everyone should sleep. She worked 18-hour days because the problem was fascinating, because every day she found something new inside it, because this was what she had been building toward for a decade, and she was not willing to do it slowly when she could do it right. The compass rose was pinned above her desk. Ruth had asked about it on a Sunday call, and Nadia had told her where it was, and Ruth had said, "Good, you'll need to know which way is north." The pilot launched in month 7. 5 community banks, just as she had told Sandra. 3 in the Southeast, 1 in Chicago, 1 in Los Angeles. Institutions ranging from 40 million to 200 million in assets. The specific problem North True solved was the gap between their back-end core banking systems and the modern digital interfaces their customers expected. A gap that was forcing community banks to either spend money they didn't have on custom solutions or lose customers to the national banks that could afford them. North True's solution was elegant. It was also, technically, quite hard. The difficulty was in the integration layer, making the product work across 17 different core banking system architectures without requiring each bank to change anything about their existing setup. Nadia's lead engineer had been working on this problem in various forms for 6 years and had a method that nobody else in the market had tried. It worked. It worked the first time, and it kept working. The results from the pilot were not supposed to be remarkable. Pilots are supposed to reveal problems, not solve them. But the data from the first 90 days was so clean that Sandra Okoro called Nadia and said, "I need you to tell me this is real." Nadia said, "Come look at the numbers." Sandra came and looked at the numbers. Customer retention at the pilot banks improved by an average of 31% in the first 60 days. Digital engagement, the metric that was driving community banks' customer losses, increased by 214%. 2 of the 5 pilot banks had begun receiving applications from customers who had specifically left national banks to join them after learning about the new digital experience. Community banks, growing by bringing customers back from Chase and Bank of America. The report went to the 3 investors. The 3 investors made phone calls. Month 9. The Chicago family office introduced Nadia to 3 other family offices with financial inclusion mandates. 2 of them asked to invest. 1 of them had a relationship with a major CDFI, a community development financial institution that was looking for a technology partner. The CDFI conversation led to a partnership announcement. The partnership announcement led to an article in a specialist publication covering community banking technology. The article was read by 4,100 people, which was not a viral number by any standard. But they were precisely the 4,100 people who mattered: community bank CEOs, credit union executives, regulators, impact investors. The 31 people Nadia had interviewed during her 3 years of research now had colleagues who were reading about what she had built. The phone started ringing. Month 12. North True had 43 signed community bank clients, not pilots, signed contracts with annual recurring revenue. The pipeline held 112 more institutions in various stages of conversation. The team had grown to 31 people. The annual recurring revenue run rate had crossed $22 million. Nadia was not sleeping enough, which she knew, and was working on, which she also knew, and which Ruth mentioned every Sunday without fail. Month 14. A report published by a financial technology research firm called Apex Analysis identified North True as the fastest-growing community banking technology company in the United States. The report noted the company's retention metrics, its growth trajectory, and the unusual nature of its funding, bootstrapped and angel-funded, with no institutional venture capital. That last line was noticed. By month 16, 3 Tier 1 venture capital firms had reached out to Nadia unsolicited. 2 of them were firms that had been on her original list of 42. Firms whose partners had given her the polite version of Garrett Finch's answer. She took the meetings. She was gracious and precise. She had the numbers, all of them, all 6 versions of the model. And the numbers by now were not projections. They were actuals, 2 years of actuals. She did not take any of the investments. She explained politely that she was examining her options. She was, in fact, already in conversation with a strategic partner that none of the VC firms knew about. A major regional bank holding company that had been watching North True's traction in the community banking space with the specific interest of a very large institution that is trying to decide whether to build something, buy something, or partner with something. They had decided to partner. The partnership agreement, announced in month 18, included a balance sheet commitment, distribution through the holding company's existing community banking relationships, and a commercial arrangement that valued North True as a business at $1.2 billion. $1.2 billion. 18 months after Nadia Carroll had incorporated with $2,850,000 and 4 employees. Garrett Finch read about it on a Thursday morning. He was in the office, the 14th-floor office in Menlo Park, and he had the Apex analysis report open on one screen and the announcement from the regional bank holding company on another screen, and a cup of coffee that was getting cold in his hand. He sat with it for a long time. His associate, a 28-year-old named Tyler, who had been in the room for the Carroll pitch 18 months ago, and who had on the drive back from lunch that day told a colleague that he thought they had made a mistake, came to the door of his office and said, "Garrett, you saw the North True thing?" Garrett Finch said yes. Tyler said, "She pitched us." Garrett said, "I know." Tyler said, "She pitched us at a $6 million ask." Garrett said nothing. He was doing math he did not want to be doing. 11.3% of $1.2 billion was a number he was very capable of calculating and very unwilling to say out loud. He had not invested $6 million because he had looked across a glass table at a woman in a gray blazer and decided, in less time than it takes to finish a cup of coffee, that the answer was no. He had not looked at the 112-page business plan. He had not read the market sizing. He had not engaged with the regulatory analysis. He had picked up his phone, and he had told her with a smile to do herself a favor. He had told her that $136 million. That was the number he could not stop thinking about. The return on a $6 million check at the announced valuation. $136 million sitting on the other side of a decision he had made in under 40 minutes. The story ran first in the Atlanta Business Journal, then in TechCrunch, then in the Wall Street Journal, which ran a profile of Nadia Carroll on a Saturday morning under the headline, "The Pitch They Passed On." The piece included, Nadia had not volunteered this. The journalist had found it through sourcing, the detail about Crestline Ventures' pass and the specific language that had been used. Garrett Finch declined to comment. Crestline's PR firm issued a statement that said the firm wished North True continued success and did not address the specifics. The statement was read with a particular quality of attention by a number of people in the venture capital community who understood exactly what it meant to have declined to comment. Tyler, the 28-year-old associate, gave an anonymous quote to a different publication a week later. The quote was, "The decision was made before she started her second slide. I think some of us knew it at the time and didn't say anything. That's on all of us. It was a remarkable thing to say on or off the record. He said it anyway." Sandra Okoro gave an interview to a podcast that covered Black women founders. She said that from the moment she read the North True business plan, she had understood that she was looking at something genuinely rare, a founder who had done the homework so completely that the business plan itself was evidence of her capability. "She didn't need to convince me she could execute," Sandra said. "The plan was the execution. It was already done." The 3 original investors, Sandra, the family office in Chicago, the retired banking regulator, each received a return that none of them would characterize publicly, but that Sandra referred to in a conversation with a colleague as the best phone call I've made in 20 years. North True expanded the team to 108 people in the 6 months following the partnership announcement. Nadia was intentional about the hiring in a way that would become something the company was known for. 43% of North True's technical staff were Black or Latino, and 37% were women. These were not numbers she had set as targets and achieved. They were the natural outcome of recruiting in places and through networks that other companies did not think to look. She had thought to look. She had been thinking to look for years. In the year following the partnership announcement, North True launched the Carroll Community Banking Grant, a program that provided technology implementation support and training to community banks and credit unions with assets under $50 million, institutions too small to be viable North True clients, but too important to be left behind. The program was funded from Nadia's personal proceeds from the partnership. It was named for Ruth. Ruth Carroll, 88 years old, still in the house on Fairfield Avenue, still with the ledger in the kitchen drawer, heard about the grant on a Sunday morning call before Nadia had a chance to tell her about it, because Tyler had mentioned it in a financial news segment, and Ruth's neighbor had called her and told her to turn on the television. When Nadia called that Sunday, Ruth said, "I saw." Nadia said, "What did you think?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you read the balance sheet right." The compass rose is still pinned above Nadia's desk. In the new office, which is in Atlanta, on a floor higher than 14, in a building that does not have Garrett Finch's name on anything. It is worn and small and gold, and most people who see it do not think to ask about it. The people who ask about it are the people Nadia wants to tell. She tells them about Ruth, about the kitchen on Fairfield Avenue, about the ledger in the drawer and the books with broken spines on every flat surface, about a woman who bought a house in 1961 and paid it off 14 years early and kept a tiny gold compass rose because she believed in knowing which way was north. She tells them, the money is the language. The people are what the language is about. If this story meant something to you, like it, share it, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next. And tell me something in the comments. Has anyone ever told you that your dream wasn't worth pursuing? Not someone who looked carefully, someone who decided in a glance. What did you do with that? I want to know. Here's what really gets me about this one. It's not the $1.2 billion valuation, though that number is worth sitting with. It's not the $136 million that Garrett Finch will be thinking about for the rest of his career. Those are the consequences. They're not the story. The story is a woman in a car on the 101 in the dark, driving home from the last no, calling her 87-year-old grandmother, and her grandmother saying, "Baby, who told you that you needed them?" That is the whole thing right there. That is the entire engine. Because Nadia Carroll did not succeed in spite of the 42 rejections. She succeeded because not one of those rejections ever touched the actual thing. The 112-page plan. The 30 years of research she had done by proxy at a kitchen table in Shreveport. The understanding of money as a language that Ruth had given her before she was old enough to know what she was receiving. They rejected the cover. They never opened the book. And I keep thinking about Garrett Finch, picking up his phone in the middle of her pitch, not even waiting for her to finish, not even giving the room enough respect to look at the second slide, because he had already decided, not based on the plan, not based on the data, based on whatever story he told himself in the first 30 seconds, about who she was and what she was worth. The thing about the compass rose is this: it doesn't point where you want to go. It points north. Always north, whether you like it or not, whether it's convenient or not, whether the direction is easy or not. Ruth bought that pin because she believed in orientation over comfort. She believed that if you know where north is, you can get anywhere. If you don't, you can wander beautifully and arrive nowhere. Nadia always knew where north was. That is what they couldn't see from across the glass table. So here's my question, and I mean it sincerely. What is your compass rose? What is the thing you keep? Maybe something worn, maybe something small, maybe something nobody else would recognize. That keeps you oriented when the room turns against you? Tell me in the comments. I think this one might start a real conversation.